Let's proceed to the next element. We have the appropriate subject matter. Now, subject matter is the source of information that will be provided to the users. So that is the source of information, and therefore that is the one subject to the evaluation or measurement, so from which the users wish to obtain information from. On the other hand, the subject matter information is the outcome of evaluation or measurement of the subject matter against the criteria. So like my example earlier, so an example of a subject matter is the financial information of a company. And the subject matter information is the financial statements. Or the financial statements of an entity. So the financial statements are the result of measuring and evaluating the financial information of the entity against a criteria. So an example of criteria is GAAP, or the Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. So like PFRS or PFRSS. So however, the subject matter of assurance engagement, as mentioned earlier, are not limited to financial information. So subject matter of an engagement can be financial or non-financial, quantitative or qualitative, subjective or objective, historical or prospective, or even physical characteristics, systems and processes, or behavior can be a subject matter of assurance engagement. But the question is, although there is a broad range of available subject matters wherein a practitioner can be requested not to perform an engagement, it is important that the subject matter must be appropriate before a practitioner can accept it as a subject matter of an engagement. So when is a subject matter appropriate? So there are two criteria. Subject matter is appropriate if, number one, it is capable of being measured or evaluated, and number two, it can be subjected to uh, or there are evidence rather available so for it to be measured or evaluated. So if these two are present, so then the subject matter is considered appropriate. So here are some examples of form of a subject matter itself, and the related subject matter information. Under financial performance or condition, so subject matter could be historical or prospective financial information. And the subject matter information could be the financial statements. So for example, the historical financial statements or the financial statements about an entity, or prospective financial information of an entity. Next, we can also have subject matter about non-financial performance or condition. So for example, performance of an aspect of organization. So like for example, performance of operating department or performance of sales personnel in terms of quantity or unit instead of amount. And the subject matter information could be sales report showing volumes of sales attained, or a production report showing number of units produced. So another form of subject matter could be physical characteristics, like for example, capacity of facility. So the subject matter information could be a report about the specifications of that facility. Another, we have systems and processes. So subject matter under this one could be the internal control or IT system of an entity. And the subject matter information could be the report on effectiveness of that internal control system or information technology system. And finally, subject matter can also be in the form of behavior. For example, corporate governance of the officers of an entity, or compliance of the company with the regulation, or practices of the human resource department of an entity or company. And the subject matter information could be the statement of compliance or statement about the effectiveness of the behavior of that particular company or entity. So these are some examples of sources of information that would be the subject matter of an engagement. Next, we go to the next element. Next element is suitable criteria. Now, criteria are the benchmarks used to evaluate or measure the subject matter, including, where applicable, benchmark for presentation and disclosures. Now, criteria can be formal, like, for example, laws, regulations, or standards, or less formal, such as internally developed code of conduct or agreed level of performance, such as, for example, the number of times the board of directors meet during a year. Now, suitable criteria are required for reasonably consistent evaluation or measurement of a subject matter, so within the context of professional judgment. Because without a frame of reference being provided by the suitable criteria, then any conclusion will be open to individual interpretation or misunderstanding. So, for example, let's say there is no PFRS to measure the financial information of a company. So, how can you say that the company is performing well or not? So, it will be subject to different interpretation if, for example, companies will just present financial information without some sort of criteria or basis of measurement to present their financial information. So that is why we have this criteria so that subject matter can be measured no consistently or evaluated consistently for a meaningful decision about the information presented by the responsible party. Okay? So some examples of applicable criteria for certain assurance engagement are as follows. So example, so audit of financial statement. So for audit of financial statement, applicable criteria could be the generally accepted accounting principles. So like for example, the Philippine Financial Reporting Standards or PFRS for SME or small and medium enterprises or US GAAP. So for IT audit, so we have COVID or control objectives, so related to information technology or control objectives of an entity or company. So for compliance auditing, it could be the laws or regulation, for example, for compliance to tax laws. So the laws and regulations could be the BIR regulations or the tax laws. So another example, capacity of a bridge. This is physical characteristic. The criteria might be the specification of the bridge or the tonnage of the bridge. Okay. So next, we have characteristics of suitable criteria. Now, the practitioner should also assess the suitability of criteria for a particular engagement by considering whether they reflect these characteristics, no relevance, completeness, reliability, neutrality, and understandability. So, meaning to say, before a criteria can be useful, it must be suitable first. So, when is a criteria or when are criteria considered suitable? So, if they contain these five characteristics. So, first we have relevance. So, when we say relevant criteria, they contribute to conclusion that assist decision making by the intended user. So, if the criteria, if measuring based on the criteria or evaluating based on the criteria result to uh, information that is useful for decision making, then they are relevant. Next, completeness. So criteria are considered sufficiently complete when the relevant factors no, that could affect the conclusion in the context of the engagement circumstances are not omitted. So complete criteria include, for example, or where relevant, benchmark for presentation and disclosure. So another important characteristic of criteria is reliability. So reliable criteria allow reasonably consistent evaluation no, or measurement of the subject matter when used in similar circumstances by similarly qualified professional. So meaning the criteria is reliable if other professional can duplicate, for example, no, the result if they measure the subject matter against the criteria. Next, neutrality. So, neutral criteria contribute to conclusions that are free from bias. So, whether, for example, the information resulting from the measurement or evaluation will be favorable or unfavorable to the entity that is there, no? So, it is free from bias. So, regardless of the result of the information. And finally, the last, we have understandability. So, understandable criteria contribute to conclusions that are clear, comprehensive, and not subject to significantly different interpretations. So take note also that the relative importance of each of these criteria or characteristic of a suitable criteria to particular engagement is a matter of professional judgment. Next, let's talk about basis or form of criteria. Criteria can be established or specifically developed. So when we say established criteria, so these are criteria that are embodied in laws, regulations, or issued by authorized or recognized bodies of experts that follow a transparent due process. So examples of established criteria include laws, regulations, or standards, no, issued by recognized bodies such as the PFRS or the Philippine GAAP, so which is being issued by a standard setting body like FRSC or the Financial Reporting Standards Council. So those are some examples of established criteria. On the other hand, specifically developed criteria are those designed for the purposes of the engagement. So for example, the criteria to evaluate or measure the performance of a segment of the company's operation would be objectives set by management. Now, those management set objectives are just designed, no, for that particular or specific engagement. So they are not something out from laws or from regulations. Now, take note also that whether established or specifically developed, the criteria should be clearly communicated to the intended users so that they will understand how the subject matter will be measured or evaluated. So because it will create confusion if they are not privy or they are not aware what criteria was used. So because sometimes there can be more than one criteria to the same subject matter. So for example, the criteria to prepare financial statements could be based on PFRS or another standard like US GAAP. So therefore, the users will be confused if it's not clearly stated what standards were used to prepare those financial statements. So not communicating the criteria may lead to misinterpretation or confusion on the part of the users. So how can you make the criteria available to intended users? So the criteria can be communicated, no, to the users in a variety of ways. For example, publicly. So for example, publishing the criteria in the web or internet, like the laws, regulation, or standards, they are available in the website of the relevant government agencies or standard setting bodies. So another way to communicate the criteria is through inclusion in a clear manner in the presentation of the subject matter information. So for example, when the subject matter information is published or released, so it includes the criteria used in arriving or measuring that information or evaluating that information. So another is to include the criteria in the assurance report. So the assurance report can also contain the criteria used in that engagement. Or finally, by general understanding. For example, the criteria to measure the time in hours or in minutes, if it's mentioned in the report that the time is measured in hours or minute, it will already be understood by the users of financial state or the users know of that information. Okay? So and then finally, in certain cases, criteria may also be available to specific intended users. For example, in the terms of a contract or criteria issued by association or organization are available only to the members of that company, association, or group. So in that case, when the identified criteria are only available not to specific users or relevant only to a specific purpose, then the use of the assurance report should only be restricted to those users only. Next element